So we, within the context of the topic mingling practice with daily life, last one or two talks that we have been speaking about is bringing awareness and mindfulness into one's activity or actions of the body, speech, and mind. And from that context, if we look carefully, a simple perspective would be is mingling practice, essence of practice being wisdom and compassion. And therefore, from the path of the teachings of Buddhism, one could say that without genuinely generating compassion, hoping for any liberation or realization would be almost impossible, is impossible. And so, no matter how much a person who begins to understand meditation or any spiritual path of practice easily understands the importance of generating compassion. But more and more, as one goes deeper and deeper into any form of practice, particularly within the Buddhist philosophy, one begins to have a much more deepened sense of insight or understanding of the profoundness of generating compassion. Early on in the beginning stages, even if we feel very connected and find virtue as well as meaning to developing compassion, it almost is, one wouldn't say superficial, but certainly a much more sympathetic vision that we have of what compassion is. We know it's a virtuous quality, we know it's helpful, it's necessary, everyone talks about it, everyone teaches it is a good quality, no one denies and argues with that. And so there's a sense of, yes, compassion is good, it is needed to be practiced, it makes sense, and therefore we should generate compassion. Further down the line, probably this person or an individual recognizes and understands suffering. Suffering not from its bleakness, or as I said yesterday, from its painful ways of looking at suffering. That's one way too. It's not a very popular topic, just as the hell realm is not a popular topic among meditators. I know that although it's a little bit changing these days, but suffering is not particularly a favorite topic, and I know in the West Coast it's even less so. But isn't it? But on the other hand, I think we can approach the topic of suffering from various areas. In beauty, there is suffering. In happiness, there is suffering. In goodness, there is suffering. In all the good part, there is suffering also. So suffering doesn't have to be all about crying and pain and blood and dying and death and all the various other ways of looking at one aspect of which is suffering. But on the other hand, suffering needs to be also understood as the enormous capacity of goodness that we have within our own selves, and yet not having the method or the skill in being able to work with it, in being able to actually share that. So one way of looking at it is, at this moment, everyone could have the best of the situation. Genuine calmness of the mind, genuine goodness, and mind experiencing some sense of peacefulness. And yet there is uncertainty, there is restlessness, there is want and not being able to give action to that aspiration, to that want. The enormous gift of love and kindness or genuine goodness that we can experience ourselves and give to the others, and yet not really finding the leeway in which to begin to work with it and begin to share with it, begin to remain within it. That's part of the suffering too. It's about having quality and not being able to manifest. Having the warmth, the gift, the love, the peace, the wisdom, and yet not having the skill. So it's almost having 99% of everything that is good, and finally that one point is missing, and that's the sadness part of it. That's the suffering part of it too. So to look at it from that perspective is also one way of looking at and understanding what genuine suffering is about. So there are different ways to look at it, and as a person does, especially one who is connected to meditation, then often has to broaden one's vision and understanding of what suffering is, what ignorance is, mainly the cause of suffering. What is that one point that does not allow the fullness and the goodness of human nature to be manifest? And so from that perspective, deepened sense of understanding, oh yes, there is the necessity to expand and extend outwardly, to be able to really work with the others. That thought arises in the mind stream of the person. And so compassion doesn't become a sense of, oh, it's a good quality to practice. Rather, it becomes a sane thing to do, the most sensible thing that seems to be there that one could do. So we are going to live an entire lifetime. We're not dead, and therefore actions are going to be accumulated. We're going to think, we're going to act, we're going to say something. And out of that understanding, a deepened understanding, an individual meditator or anyone connected to the spiritual path of the practice begins to get a much more expansive view of what compassion is. Doesn't become some quality to just adopt, but becomes a way of life, becomes a way of being able to say, of all the actions that I do, and there's this force that compels me to perform these actions. I would like to be a good person. I would like to generate good qualities, refrain from creating ground causes of suffering and pain for myself and for the others. And yet, driven by one's own habitual tendencies, it is very difficult to keep that mindfulness at all times. Therefore, from that, some sense of deepened understanding, insight, and analysis within one's own self, as well as I spoke about yesterday, experience of the world in general, sentient beings and their actions in general, thinking about karma, one begins to have a much more expansive foundation of compassion. At that time, basic sanity, basic awareness, mindfulness becomes compassion. So compassion doesn't become a different quality to adopt. Compassion more permeates in bringing awareness of one's own actions of body, speech, and mind. And there are efforts that we bring into the path of the practices, and that becomes living with practice. But then through that again, and especially combined with the understanding of the teachings, deepening one's meditation, deepening one's spiritual practices, furthermore, then comes a stage when one really then begins to see what compassion actually means. And so there's a gradual progress of the understanding of what compassion is. Ultimately, when one does gain some understanding, deepened understanding of what the teachings are talking about, then we begin to get the first glimpse of realizing what a profound word it is, that we never thought that it was this expansive. And so something what we intend to do as I grew up, and I think it's the same with many, is that we begin to work with compassion. In the beginning, it is about visualizing somebody, generating compassion, reminding yourself that all sentient beings have been your mothers and fathers in one lifetime or the other, trying to work with that, generating compassion, working with generosity, training in your actions, and so that you mindfully remind yourself to be generous, to be patient, to be tolerant, to be diligent, to be exertion of effort. You try to give in thoughts, you try to give in action. So there's a whole process of learning what compassion is. Eventually, if a person is fortunate in being able to really realize the essence of the teachings, then there comes to be a point when one sees the very vastness and the limitless profoundness of what compassion actually means. And compassion at that time doesn't become simply relegated to being a quality of all the qualities that need to be developed. So one doesn't go about saying generosity, kindness, love, sympathy, and compassion. That tendency to separate compassion as a different quality among many others that need to be developed no longer becomes necessary. Neither does it become necessary to even do the two things that we normally do, wisdom and compassion, as we say. That also doesn't become any longer necessary. Compassion simply becomes the vastness of everything from where arises the profound essence of the true nature. And so in that way, one could say the absolute nature of mind is nothing other than the genuine compassion. And so the permeating space of the primordial wisdom of mind, wisdom nature of mind, the very basic awareness and the brilliance of wisdom, any realization or enlightened quality of that expansiveness of emptiness arises in that way if we were able to give it some expression, although it is said to be beyond expression. But if one were to go into trying to express something that is inexpressible, it would be nothing other than compassion, the brilliance of compassion. And so what is there that we create of all the actions of our body, speech, and mind that is totally free from any negativity, any stain, And then we find nothing other than the brilliance of compassion. That compassion that becomes the very absolute essence of all the teachings, all the practices, that is what then needs to be emphasized. That is what needs to be developed. The difficulty of all the various reasons and causes that become difficult in our lives and that leads to the separation of meditation and daily life, one is also because of lacking in compassion. Through the gradual progresses, whether it is adopting the quality of compassion, to trying to transform our negativities into compassion, to the transcendence of realizing the true nature of one's own mind, which is nothing but compassion. Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana teachings and the essences of these teachings, one does, through that progression of understanding, compassion, what we do encounter is the difficulties in each phases when we can't understand the very essence of genuine love, genuine compassion. And so simple words would be is we just don't like people. And that's our main problem. All the technical or traditional ways of saying this, if I use a simple language to sum it up, it is that we can't mingle or we can't integrate daily life and the practice. And the difficulty it comes back into is that the genuine compassion is what is most difficult to practice. And therefore, why it is difficult to practice is we don't like people very much. That's the simple reason. And so in meditation, it's not that we dislike, but then the other fact is that there is no such great liking for it too. There's a part of our life, there's a part of our mind which often talks about three basic poisons: desire, anger, and ignorance. And everyone, most of you who have been with teachings for several years are familiar with how these become the root causes of confusion. In that context, we talk about desire, which leads to a biased mind that likes someone that you love very much, to whom you are attached to. Then we talk about the problems of anger and aggression and dislike, the strong emotion of dislike that deviates the mind from its primordial ground because we dislike certain people that harm us or we don't get along with. But then a bulk of it, these two forms, even at the most we could say, it's probably statistics, Tibetans are never good at statistics, but nevertheless, if I could attempt one, 10% like, 10% dislike. But the remaining 80% is about indifference. It's the ignorance. Therefore, when we say the root cause of ignorance, and so very often we tend to really concentrate on the aggression part and on the desire part, liking and the disliking part. We try to lessen our dislike for the others. We try to lessen our like and attachment to certain, but we don't really work with the indifference, because to us, neutrality doesn't seem to be that much of a difficulty, and we keep thinking that that is okay, we can work with that. It's the anger that I need to really work with. It's the aggression and my attachment that needs to be mainly worked with. And with that, we are working with 20% of our problems and negating the necessity to work with that remaining powerful part of our mind, the 80% of ignorance that is there, indifference, simple indifference. So loving kindness and compassion, whether from the Hinayana perspective, Mahayana, or Vajrayana perspective, simply doesn't work and become stronger and more refined, and the profoundness of its true meaning doesn't manifest because bulk of our negativity, that indifference, is very strongly in our mind. And so we go about doing our things, at the best refraining from saying something harmful or doing something harmful to the others, and doing the best we can in generating love for those who we think we can give love to, but never really working with that indifference in our mind. And we try to keep out of the lives of other sentient beings. We don't interfere with their lives. We pretend not to see many things. We pretend not to know many things. And so ignorance just survives. And as we said yesterday, ego grasping can survive in anything. It can even say, to the degree of saying, you're doing the best here, by simply not sort of interfering in many different areas. And it is okay to work in one's own capacity. So oftentimes in meditation, we also think, yes, I could do more. I could generate more loving kindness. But at the same time, you do console yourself by saying you're doing the best you can at this moment, and you need to feel more ready to go beyond one's own capacity and the limitations that we give to our own self. And so when we create a boundary of limitation, and this is as much as I can do, there's no courage involved in it. There's no going beyond one's own hesitation. And that's listening to a discursive mind. That's listening to a mind that's always going to say you're not ready for it. You can't go beyond that. You can't really do selfless compassion at this point because you're not ready for it. And we keep doing that, and that doesn't allow, again, the deepening of the understanding of selfless compassion to be there. So all these reasons being there, therefore, one way to begin with it probably would be is to begin with what Buddha taught the first time, and that's what we spoke about yesterday, working with suffering, understanding suffering, and deepening one's understanding of suffering so that the mind is able to gradually go into research, go into examining understanding of what sentient beings are. And so much of our understanding being literal and intellectual, going beyond that to actually observe in one's own life as well as observing the lives of the others and learning from that. Then that further needs to be refined by joining the understanding of suffering with impermanence. Not only, as we talked about yesterday morning, as you observe the different ways of working of the sentient beings, you also see how much of an understanding of impermanence is there in the minds of that other person. And likewise, how much of an impermanence am I able to bring into mine? Is impermanence not there? Impermanence is there at all times. Change and transition is there all times. Just as a person does drawings on the river as it flows, that there is no drawing that can be made on the river because the current of the river is that it moves on. But one can keep drawing on the river and imagining there to be a picture. We can do that. And just likewise, we tend to do that. We grasp at many things. We become very stoic, indignant, stubborn, egoistic, arrogant, aggressive, ignorant, very attached and grasping. And all of these are just marks of how we are trying to paint a picture on a flowing river. And therefore, where is the understanding of impermanence within my own actions, in the way that I am holding on to my own distress, to my own suffering, to my own sort of need for justification, whether or not that makes sense? What am I doing, and what is the difference between me and a deluded person, an insane person? Likewise, the whole system, the world system is doing that. Everyone around us, we keep holding, we keep grasping emptiness. And therefore, that leads to, again, deepen what is the nature, what is emptiness, the third mark. And therefore, from the understanding of emptiness and working again and again, analyzing again and again on the nature of emptiness, on transition and change and impermanence, and that is how ignorance arises, and we keep wanting something, never create the ground of that want. Simple fact being that we want happiness, and yet we create confusion, we create ignorance. That ignorance is going to generate suffering. We are not going to want suffering, so we are continuously running away from something, but continue to again plow and sow the seed from where the same kind of experience is going to arise. And like a potter's wheel, we keep going round and round in circles again and again. Periodically, we say, I want liberation, or I want to benefit all sentient beings, but more or less just going round and round in that circle. And so taking time to reflect upon that. Taking time to reflect upon that, from which then generation of wanting to attain some liberation or freedom from that suffering does come about. So for Siddhartha, it took just 4 things: to see birth, to see old age, to see sickness, and to see death, and then bringing up a strong sense of motivation that I need to be free from it. We see birth, old age, sickness, and death all the time. The difference being that strengthening mind of wanting to come out of that cycle, that if there really is a want to be free from unhappiness, from suffering, to really genuinely gain peacefulness in oneself, as well as do something good for the others, from a much more, let's say, philosophical or a spiritual perspective, or keeping it very simple, it is a human life. It is a life that is filled with good qualities, especially basic awareness and sanity. Doesn't need to be wasted in simply doing the things that almost any sentient being can do. So if it is only about waking up, doing the same thing again until you're exhausted and going to sleep, and periodically eating 3 meals a day and then making a lot of noise, if that's about what life is, that's not really looking at what the potential of a human being is about. One can think, how much do I think? One can do activities, how much of that activities is beneficial? I can talk and say something. Why not do something useful? Why not say something good? Why not say something that at least at the time of death would give oneself the thought that at least it was used in a proper way? A mind that is sharp and aware, that can create, that can do a lot of thinking and has common sense. Why not bring about the ability to produce something that is peaceful for oneself and for the others? And so whether in a much more spiritual way, whether in a very simple way, it is a human life. It's a precious life and therefore needs to be utilized in a good way. When we grew up, and again, our teachers, oftentimes when we probably did not do our practices well, one of the things that they would always say is hold us. And there was one particular teacher who would shake us and say, what's the difference between your life and a wandering stray dog's, a mongrel's life? And so chamchi is the Tibetan word, that's a mongrel, actually, a stray dog. And so they're shaking us and meditation, so what's the difference between your life and a mongrel's life? And so that was good in many ways, in that you have to begin to examine and see what's the difference. A mongrel or a stray dog, as an example, is one who survives, isn't it? Wanders in search of something, of food, and then finds a cozy corner and goes to sleep. Occasionally there is danger, and so you stay away from it. If you spend time looking at it, looking at that kind of a life, and then you look at one's own life, it's quite the same thing, isn't it? There's not really much of a difference. And yet we human beings do tend to believe we are the most wisest of all the species, and all this creation that we have done about, that also is mark of its wisdom. But from a much more spiritual perspective, then 18 qualities that we have all attained that then constitute ourselves as the precious human existence. And so just as in a heap of dirt one finds a precious wish-fulfilling jewel, it is said that we are able to see that this body, this life of a human being, is a precious jewel, a wish-fulfilling precious jewel. What does a wish-fulfilling precious jewel do? Is that whatever you aspire to it, it is said traditionally, there are many anecdotes which says, if you get a wish-fulfilling jewel, you prostrate to it 3 times and you make a wish and it gets fulfilled. But if you look carefully into our own lives, that's the same thing. You can actually fulfill all aspirations with this human life. The body, the mind, and the speech that we have has that immense capacity to actually bring about genuine goodness. There are no causes and conditions that are negative and so very poisonous that jump into our own selves and demonstrate and manifest their power. There is no such thing. And therefore, we keep thinking that there are these obstacles that do not allow the wisdom to arise. If we look intrinsic of one's own self, there's this full potential of genuine loving kindness and compassion that does not have to be meditated and understood, that does not have to be memorized and studied from books to be understood. It is an intrinsic quality that is already there. What religion and philosophy and meditation and practices do is they remind us. They strengthen that quality and give it the space of growth and familiarity. That is what it does. But it does not plant something new. It is an intrinsic nature and a quality that is already there, that needs to be nourished, that needs to be cared for. Just as we give the negative poisons or defilements, whether it's anger, aggression, how does it become so very powerful that causes the emotional upheavals in our lives? Is we give it enough time and we let it become familiar in ourselves. Reason why the empty nature of these thoughts, empty nature, because as much as we see what their nature is like, what its essence is, we can't find a solid evidence of its existence. We did that in the afternoon session yesterday. And so given that empty nature of the emotions, yet why does it become powerful is we just give it more time to demonstrate itself again and again. We make it more familiar. We allow it the growth. It's almost like nurturing for it, caring for it, giving it space, giving it many opportunities to go about doing its things and demonstrating its manifestations. Likewise, we do not do with the other qualities that we so much aspire to do. So the beginning would be is just giving it enough time to come back and become just as familiar, to generate its manifestations often enough, to become more familiar with the positive qualities. And therefore, from that perspective, meditation and practices is about creating enough ground and space so that similar, likewise, antidotes or positive qualities gain at least enough ground of familiarity and a place to become more active, place to gain more strength, more momentum. That's what meditation is about. As that gains more momentum, it gradually should increase its space and ground so that the mind is more familiar with the awareness, with the mindfulness, with the generation of the positive qualities. And therefore, the entering into the path of meditation is about benefiting other sentient beings. And so in the Buddhist context, when we talk about benefiting sentient beings, now another thing that comes about is engaging in benefiting other sentient beings and meditating for other sentient beings. Two things that often is a topic that's discussed. And so engaging in acts of generosity, loving kindness, these are all very essential parts of practicing kindness and compassion. But on the other hand, your meditation and practice and dedicating your life to spiritual practices of generating compassion is perhaps really the most essential and the greatest gift that one can give to the others. Temporarily, it does not seem to produce so many results as, let's say, actively giving to somebody might. And so Buddhism has often encountered some amount of, let's say, questioning especially from among Buddhists and as well as others about how we talk about selfless compassion, but in terms of putting it into practice, we find many other people doing much more social services or engaging in kindness and compassion than Buddhist meditators who continually talk about selfless compassion, but seemingly look like some of the most selfish spiritual meditators ever. We're sort of concentrated on our individual practice and liberation. And so often people ask the questions about what is the action involved in, or the action that's generated from the Buddhist meditations. It is very true. In many ways, it is very, very true in that we do become preoccupied with trying to liberate everyone, that we don't even have time to do simple acts of kindness and compassion. That's very, very true. On the other hand, we can remedify that. And it never has been a problem in some ways, simply because there is the ability, there is in meditation, the motivation that is most essential. And the motivation, if it is individualistic, then that's the wrong view. But in the context of meditating, there is also an enormous contribution or commitment to transform one's own self so that whatever it produces in the future is genuine, non-fabricated, and truly a selfless act of compassion. Knowing that as much generosity and kindness we may be able to do at this moment, one can't really be sure how much is really selfless, how much does get involved and intertwined within one's own selfish motivations, and we take great sort of pacification of our own ego and our own arrogance and feeling good about a certain activity. And therefore, if we are going to really help sentient beings, it has to begin with first training the root cause of indifference, root cause of anger, aggression, and attachment. That needs to be transformed, that needs to be transcendent, where from that then any action that might come about may be better refined, may be much more clean or pure in intent and in action. And so in that way, being able to really have a balance of both relative. When you are meditating and trying to understand compassion as the most essential, profound quality to be developed, mind continues to deepen. Mind needs to, in meditation, deepen its understanding of the importance of compassion, importance of genuine bodhicitta, genuine selfless compassion. And that, however, does not impede generosity, relative compassion. You can always, and you need to, continually be kind in the actions of body, be able to have mindfulness of the speech so that it doesn't harm or hurt any sentient being, mentally generating genuine kindness and mindfulness of body, speech, and mind. These are relative compassion that can continually be practiced. Anyone who enters the path of Buddhism enters through the gateway of the Hinayana teachings. And that basic discipline is 10 virtuous, 10 unvirtuous actions that need to be abandoned, 10 virtuous actions that need to be cultivated. That is the relative responsibility that you have. Plus, together with that, Mahayana teachings of the 6 paramitas and the 4 immeasurables need to be the relative practice that needs to be there. From actually relatively engaging in compassion, mind gains even a much more profounder and a deepened impact and understanding of one's own self as the others. Until one actually gives, one doesn't have the experience of compassion. When one does, one gets a better view and an insight about the different tendencies of grasping that are there. And we never imagine how difficult giving can be. We never can imagine how difficult not lying or not stealing or not being covetousness of another person or slandering or criticism of the another person. We never really understand how difficult it is until we engage in that action. When you engage, it again reflects backward into one's own self, into seeing how it is in terms of self-grasping, how easily ignorance arises, how easily aggression and ego-grasping arises. And so back and forth, the mind goes between relative compassion and absolute compassion in knowing oneself better. Knowing oneself better refines engaging in compassion. Again, engaging in compassion gives a deeper perspective of what one's own ego-grasping is about. And so, combined with all the other teachings of understanding emptiness, understanding change and impermanence, how ignorance becomes the cause of suffering, and how samsara is formed, mind of the meditator working with that compassionate activity begins to get a deeper sense of understanding of how samsara and nirvana is formed. And therefore, confusion, chaos or suffering, how it is formed, how ignorance deludes the mind, what the true nature is like, and how easily we get deviated from the true nature. That then deepens the understanding. So from that perspective, being able to work with compassion in all its different levels begins to then become the very key, let's say, instruction or practice that allows it to not only be limited, spiritual practice to not only be limited on the cushion, but to actually put it into practice. And so that's the main intention. And so if we are looking at it, then we find that in meditating upon compassion, there has to be, supported by the relative activity, meditation is the ability to know better the confusion, the neurosis, the root cause of the mind that is not able to generate compassion and wisdom. And so in that meditation, the motivation is always there. How can I better my mind to love sentient beings? How can I make the mind less grasping, less confused, less driven by the ignorance of habitual tendencies? How can the mind still overcome the indifference that is there, getting to know one's own self? And so meditation and the time that one gives to practice and meditation is another way of exerting genuine effort to benefiting other sentient beings. And so when you have the strengthened mind of awareness in meditation, taking that into action then makes it better, makes it less confused, makes it less selfish, and therefore more selflessness as arises. And so it is in a way of being able to come back to the cushion and saying, may I do this for the benefit of all sentient beings? And so if you are meditating, then there is always one moment where you need to generate the right motivation. And that is essential in seeing that any teaching that I enter into, any practice that I enter into, may that be a complete gesture of kindness and compassion to all the sentient beings. How does it do? Is simply that what you chew and get the flavor of in terms of tasting, of learning about yourself, about the causes of confusion, of the causes that lead to better ability to genuinely generate loving kindness and compassion, that is being processed at this moment in meditation. And so if one truly wants to integrate practice into daily life, then that's why one would say there is nothing really more profound than beginning to first work with a simple thing, and that's liking people. Over the years of practice, over the years of meditation, something that becomes more and more clear for most meditators is that the most challenging thing is to be able to begin every day by a simple phrase, I'm going to like people. If you start with that, that also, I think, takes care of many of the different things. Is that the simple inability to go beyond the limitations one gives oneself. And therefore, anything that we look into, the tendency is to find fault. Tendency is to either be indifferent towards that or to find some fault. And to be able to remove that when one tries deliberately in the beginning, of course, although it should be non-deliberate, non-fabricated, but while in the path of learning, if there is even a deliberate reminding of oneself to cease criticism, and to generate more tolerance and more love, then most of the things that we do seem to take as difficulties, lessons, or becomes more sort of spontaneously is more solved. Whether it is hatred, whether it is jealousy, whether it is, again, nothing to do with the external, but more involvement with one's own self, more involvement with one's own pain, one's own suffering, one's own irritation, one's own difficulties that one may be having in this life, for whatever reasons it may be, then again, being able to somehow allow oneself to extend towards the others within its own self dissolves that self-involvement that is there within one's own self. So much of the difficulties, emotional difficulties that obstruct the peacefulness of the mind comes about because of inwardness, too much involvement of one's own self and thinking about it again and again, where there isn't the ability to generate a thought that goes beyond self-absorption. And so training in compassion is being able to look into the lives of the others. And so one of the examples would be is, it's a human nature. But sometimes when people come with various difficulties, now when you ask for interviews from different teachers, and of course most of it is about certain difficulties or questions that one may be facing in life. But occasionally we meet with people, no matter what you say doesn't solve the problem. And they really go through many difficulties in their life. They've just separated from someone they love, their children don't listen to them, they've lost their job, they've lost their house, they're not able to pay their mortgage, the courses or the teachings are too expensive, Sangha members are not kind, the teacher has said something that was not very nice thing to hear. Just about everything is falling apart in their life and they are having tremendous difficulties. At that moment, when we encounter certain times, at these moments, personally, I don't know about the other teachers, but personally when I do encounter that, no matter what you tell the person about impermanence or about suffering of samsara or about devotion or any other method of practice or trusting the teachings or not losing confidence, nothing seems to work at that moment. What I have found is to give them even a bigger problem than that. And more would be is if they are involved in someone else's problem that seems to be bigger in that. And then the other person does seem to really have less sense of difficulties. And so if suddenly we let this person go and meet with a person who is almost in even a much more worse state, and if that person says, someone died and I cannot forget this person, and no matter how much you tell this person about death and impermanence, if it is not helping, then you talk about two people who've died in your life. Then that person seems to calm down a little bit and think about, oh, your problem is much worse. And so recently I had someone do this, and then this person came back with, in 15 minutes, the change in that person where more than my suffering, it was about how sorry she or he was about this other person's problem. And so some sort of total letting go of one's own self, seeing the other person's suffering. That's also one quality that is there. And therefore, suffering, pain, compassion is also a skillful method. It does become sometimes terribly difficult to work with our own selves because we're always looking into my field of experience and what I am going through. And therefore, learning, educating, and engaging in an activity where you do appreciate the enormous amount of suffering and pain others are going through also helps one's own self. There's some sense of selfish way of looking at it, but then there's also the truth of knowing that much of our problems get blown up because of our smallness of the view. We simply don't go beyond my own experience and the world of my own experience. Therefore, the kindness of the teachings have to be appreciated in that it talks about all the different kinds of sufferings that are there. For example, in the Vajrayana preliminary teachings of the four thoughts that transform the mind. For example, many people have a lot of difficulties when it goes through the four reminders or the four thoughts that transform the mind. Absolute foundation of the Buddhist teachings. It is said that without a thorough understanding and confidence in what is being said in the instructions of the four reminders, or Londok Nambashi as they are called, four thoughts that transform the mind. Why are they called transforming the mind? Is that does allow the mind to truly go through the process of from the small view to the bigger view, from the smallness of one's own self to the expansiveness of knowing samsara in its totality, why it is essential. And why does teachers such as Patrul Rinpoche relish so much in detail about the sufferings of the different realms, where he describes in detail what you all have a lot of difficulty with, the 18 realms of the hell, isn't it? where it talks about detail about the shape of the saw and the sawing of the body into the 8 different parts, and then again coming back. Many of you might have read it, and you should read it. There's a whole detail of almost beginning to say, is it really like this as it describes? And Patrul Rinpoche in the end says 1,000-fold more than what I have been able to explain is the actual experience of the person and the being going through that different field of experience. And that's essential to learn. Talks about blisters, 4-petal blisters, 8-petal blisters, 16-petal blisters with pus and blood coming out, and then the cries and the laments of the sentient beings in that. Why does it become necessary for someone to take? It's not about Patrul Rinpoche's sadistic way of then taking great relish in the suffering of the sentient beings. It's about knocking into the stubborn mind into understanding that yes, it is possible. That just because you and I don't see it doesn't mean that the limitations of our creation abilities or creative abilities of our mind is relegated only to what you and I can experience and what you and I can paint. It's about like a painting. If you and I sit down today and begin to make a painting, and we make an entire painting on this wall over here, we could probably bring in every bit of imagination that we know that we want to express on this canvas. But at the same time, a truth fact is that if any new person comes into this room, he may be or she may be able to add on something that you and I, both together here with our creative abilities, could not draw or paint on this canvas. And therefore, limitless number of sentient beings, and each sentient being with that creative ability of manifestation, goes through a tremendous amount of experiences, suffering as well as goodness. Everything that I define as being suffering is in the realm of my creative mind. Everything happiness and cause of happiness is also the creative ability of my very creative mind. Similarly, any definition of suffering and happiness that you might have is your creative ability, and therefore it manifests according to your creative ability. But we have to give also the space for other sentient beings to have their view and their perspective. An ant that is on the floor at this moment has a very different perspective of what the floor is compared to my vision of what the floor is. And so in that way, perceptions change. With perceptions, your ideas change. With ideas, your actions change. And you create different actions, you create different activities and causes and conditions, and you create your realm of experience. Just as combinedly, you and I have created this realm of existence, we have to give credit to other creative abilities of sentient beings who have their own creative abilities of creating their own realm of existence. And so 6 realms is just a very general classification of the realms. Just as many individuals there are, we all have different capabilities of creating our own realm of existence and define accordingly what happiness is, what suffering is. And so what one sees as water, one sees as blood, one sees as fire, one sees as a habitant place, a place of habitat. And therefore, in that way, just as each perception of the sentient beings changes, manifold experiences of beings changes. As a meditator, it becomes essential to then appreciate vastness of this expansive field or realm of existence, each being going through their own experiences, and how in different experiences, different realms, we have managed to create our own suffering, our own confusion, our own desires of happiness and goodness. And therefore, the teachings as they go through the understanding trains the mind to reflect upon the existence of other sentient beings whose pain and suffering is much more greater to mine. That does not mean denying or negating one's own pain and suffering. That is taken too, and one works with it gradually, but at the same time not making that the focus, so much focus of self-absorption that it does not allow the mind to go into, at least if nothing, a comparison of what is happening in the world, and therefore not seeing this as the very total end, and sense of complete dejection not being there becomes necessary. And so in generating compassion through learning about other sentient beings, through seeing the experiences or understanding the suffering or the experiences of other sentient beings, and to them generating kindness and compassion, again, inwardly, whether we see it or not, does benefit one's own self. And so without there being the necessity to sort of talk about, may through this meditation I arise as benefiting from it, or may it benefit one's own self, that doesn't become necessary. Mahayana teaches about that. Mahayana teaches about being able to gain the same result without sounding so very selfish. One way of putting it would be two, isn't it? And nevertheless, the mind, again, doesn't work with that. Not understanding the experiences of the other sentient beings, we become so very involved with individual happiness, individual suffering, and even meditation that we do tend to direct it towards only one's own individual liberation and individual happiness, individual attainment, and so forth. And so that again then feeds into the ego, feeds into the same selfish mode, comes back to the same habitual tendencies. So if we see all these reasons being there, Buddhism has been given in sort of sequential, progressive stages. Hinayana understanding, Mahayana understanding, Vajrayana understanding, abandoning negativities to attain goodness or ground of fruition for one's own self, fruition of happiness, then being able to see that that is again a more self-absorbed intention, and therefore Mahayana teachings working with the ability to expand the view, understanding others' suffering, so that the compassion becomes a lot more expansive. And then gradually being able to also see that as much compassion as you generate to the sentient beings, it still will encounter difficulties if there is grasping. And therefore the cause of grasping must be completely dissolved, and so emptiness that is taught within Madhyamika and then the Vajrayana teachings allows even a greater natural or a spontaneous pervasive compassion to be there because of releasing or destroying the root cause of grasping. And so emptiness is emphasized in that. And so there's the process of gradually working within it. And so as a meditator, being able to first enter, if one is entering into a spiritual path of practice, that is the intention with which we begin to meditate. In simple words, that is why beginning of any session or any meditation, we begin with generation of bodhicitta, motivation. Motivation then allows the mind to recognize why at all we do the things we do. If we are sitting in a certain posture, breathing in a certain technical way, visualizing any deities, reciting any mantras, why do we do it? We do it for this purpose so that the compassion can be better refined. We do it with this intention and different skills and methods that are applied so that it comes back into liking people better, lessening the grasping so that genuine compassion may be there. Why compassion is necessary is because without that compassion, we create the ground of suffering which we do not want. And therefore, interlinking or connecting this, then beginning to see the purpose in spiritual meditation becomes essential. And so with that, yesterday we were doing the text here, looking at the different qualities. And again, each text or topic can be seen in different contexts. We can explain it in given that situation. And similarly, likewise, this preliminary text, which is usually given to people entering Vajrayana path of practice, is again about examining the qualities of a teacher, examining qualities within a student, and then the third section of a brief meditation, which could also be referred to as resting within the inseparability of samsara and nirvana, or resting within the inseparability of relative and absolute truth. And so in that aspect, we were joining it with seeing the qualities and examining the qualities of the teacher in order to not to see the fault in somebody else, but in order to ensure that the mind that is entering the path of the practice to truly generate compassion be free from confusion, not meet with all those obstacles that we do meet in our path of practice. And so as we said here, we enter into the path of practice with the intention to generate a genuine compassion, knowing that that compassion is what cuts through the ignorance. And if we do not want suffering, if we want happiness, if we want to really benefit all sentient beings, or if simply to have the ability to live this life in a way that does not resemble a stray dog, for example, we use that analogy. If there is the intention to make some good use of this human life, then with that intention, we enter into the path of practice. As you enter into the path of practice, you are dedicating your body, speech, and mind to go through the transformation from that ground which you are very familiar with. we are going to be able to enter into a path of practice which is saying, let go of anger, let go of aggression, let go of this, let go of that. There is no self, it is empty. You are going to be entering into a path where you have to work with trust and confidence. That is what we spoke about. Any difficulty that the trust and confidence arises brings about enormous hesitations, and then that becomes the obstacle for the ego grasping to return again and again. For that purpose, we examine the teachers, the teachings that we receive. On the other hand, examination of the student can be taken in two ways too. A teacher needs to examine a student so that one is able to see the container within which the teachings are being given. But for those of us who are students and receive teachings from our teachers, it is also essential to see, do I have that quality or not? Because that quality that is being asked to see whether the student or the disciple or the teacher has or not also determines how very much you are able to ripen and have the readiness of the mind to enter into that what we are thinking we are going to be cultivating. So when we begin in the morning, let's say, and you sit in meditation and we begin to say, oh yes, it would be very nice to really be of benefit to all sentient beings. A simple way of looking at it is, do I really know what I am saying? Do I really know what it will take to be able to really realize this aspiration? Within that aspiration of wanting to benefit sentient beings, you will have to give up a lot of things, isn't it? And so yesterday, briefly, we talked about the difficulty in not attaining enlightenment is because we don't want enlightenment. That's one way of looking at it, is simply because when we get closer and closer to understanding the profoundness of Dharma, and we begin to realize what it means when we say egoless or selflessness and what it entails, then we are not really ready to give up that much. Our beginning of the journey, we often want enlightenment, but that enlightenment is a sense of getting everything you want and not getting anything that you don't want, isn't it? And so when ultimately it gets closer and closer to saying, oh, this is also being taken away, that is also being taken away, this also needs to go, then it doesn't sound very interesting, isn't it? And so we thought enlightenment and realization and egoless and selflessness was going to be bitter and sweet and some flavor of chocolate, some vanilla, some raspberry, some strawberry. You know, all those nice flavors that if you chewed in this way, it would taste this, and if you chewed in that way, it would taste that way. Eventually, when we get a closer look at the inside story, then we begin to say it doesn't have a flavor. It doesn't have a taste. It's asking you to keep quiet. It's asking you to stay still. It's asking you to stay in the primordial nature, which sounds very nice, but is quite boring in that sense, isn't it? And therefore, the mind thinks, maybe I take one step backwards. And that's where, instead of enlightenment, we all want to become bodhisattvas, who can not be tainted and not have all the karmic repercussions, but enlightenedly come back again and again to benefit sentient beings, to sit on this throne and to teach and tell them how ignorant you are and how wise I am. And that whole nursing and social workers theory that we bring into what we think is a bodhisattva, that we keep thinking is what we want to become. Not realizing that while we do this, we are creating karma. You tell a lie, you're egoistic, you're arrogant, you demonstrate all kinds of negative tendencies, you create karma. That brings you where you started, or even worse, completely dismantles every goodness that one has created. Samsara doesn't change. Confusion still continuously is there. That cyclic existence continuously is there. Therefore, in examining these qualities is being able to see and challenge yourself into seeing how very serious you are with what you are trying to do. Spiritual practice, at least from the Buddhist perspective, is not about doing things that are feeling good about it. It will require a person to come to a point of complete commitment to developing those qualities that when we think and we understand to be true. For a few time, a little short period of time, everyone can dabble in this and that. And as I always say, compared to not doing anything, doing something is always better. And so when people have, let's say today in the modern world, when people have all kinds of meditations for the businessmen and meditations for the weekenders, and Oprah Winfrey does meditation weekends, and I don't think Jerry Maguire does it, but all kinds of meditation techniques that are coming in. I think they are good in that comparatively that without any kind of awareness, any method, even if it's selfish, even if it is entertaining, even if it is completely immersed in, let's say, materialistic tendencies, it is good. It brings about some pause, some thinking, some awareness. It is connecting to some aspect of deepened wisdom, of one's own intrinsic wisdom. But in the context of a spiritual practice of meditation, who you are, who I am, when we say we've met with these teachings, when we say we've met with teachers, when you and I sit on that meditation cushion and assume the posture of a meditator, then it will require that we actually commit ourselves to transcendence and transformation of the mind. Then it no longer becomes possible for oneself to fabricate or to lie, and deceptive tendencies to be generated where we say one thing and we don't do it. Integrating practice into daily life then comes back into confidence of what you are doing, and that you are serious enough and honest enough to that approach, and you realize what its inner potential and essence is, that you have enough confidence to actually put it into practice. And so, lacking in confidence, lacking in the genuine understanding of the essence of the teachings, that also becomes the impediment that does not allow us, or the obstacle that does not allow us to bring the teachings into practice. So search in your own mind. Look into your own self and see, why do I allow that hesitation or that lacking in mindfulness to become the obstacle, that so much of knowledge that I do know about how to develop these qualities, I am not able to bring into my path of the practices. And so here too, in the context of the qualities that we are talking about, then how to examine oneself would be examine whether or not these qualities are something that is present within one's own self. So continuing with the text, yesterday we talked about 10 qualities that are said to be general qualities that you should examine in a teacher, and to ensure that these are the qualities that are there or not. Those were the qualities that are related to mainly general, all teachers. Or in particular, if you are taking Tantra or Vajrayana instructions, Mantrayana instructions, then to these 10 qualities you would further investigate whether these later qualities are again there or not. These additional qualities should also be examined. First is then said to be examining carefully whether or not the teacher from whom you receive Vajrayana instructions or Mantrayana instructions are accomplished in the threefold knowledges or the threefold qualities. And these threefold qualities are Jetsun in the understanding, in-depth realization and understanding of the Utpati or generation, Kirim phase, and whether or not there is the quality of the Dzogrim, completion, or the Sampanakrama, understanding, as well as in the non-dual realization of the non-dual essence of arising and generation and completion, or Utpati and Sampanakrama, Kirim and Dzogrim practices. Whether or not that understanding is there should be examined. And so that examination is receiving teachings in the form of all the Utpati in Vajrayana, the generation of deities and what they are. Thorough understanding, thorough exponent, thorough commentary, as well as having the transmissions of understanding what Utpati means. Similarly, the explanations that you listen to, that you are able to have doubts and questions about, which need to be answered. That answer leading to your penetration of that hesitation that allows the mind to better understand the essence of what completion or Sampanakrama is about. Ultimately, how much within the instructions there is the emphasis in knowing the non-duality of Utpati Sampanakrama, where how much of the ability to really realize the essence of the non-duality of Kirim and Dzogrim is there, that needs to be carefully understood too. When one receives instructions and teachings, there are different approaches. In the beginning, as I said, yesterday we talked a little bit about different ways of relating to teachings. In the beginning, when we don't know much about the teachings, we receive instructions from many teachers. That is then the first approach. In that respect, you don't really develop that intensive relationship. You feel devotion, you feel respect, You love this person that you are receiving teachings from, and with all humility, because you are receiving enormous amount of learning and understanding, therefore you are the empty vessel. And so that empty vessel within which the contents of the teachings are being poured, there's respect, there's loving that person, there's tremendous devotion to this person from whom you are receiving the teachings, but you don't know this person, isn't it? And not knowing this person, but having love and respect for this person works simultaneously. It's not difficult. Sometimes we get stuck in the references of the word, and then we think, how can I love and not know? How can I have a little bit of questioning and not know this person and yet have respect for this person? It's about the same way as you make friends. You don't know this person, you don't know the full story of this person, but you like this person. And so it is a first step that you begin to take, and in that first step is where you are learning about many things. When we begin to hear teachings of the three prajnas, when you begin to learn many teachings and read and understand many teachings, a lot of questions come up, and therefore, how are those questions being answered is the next clue, or the clue that leads to the next stages of receiving the teachings. And so in learning, in studying, especially Hinayana and Mahayana teachings, is at a moment when you are taking in a lot of instructions, a lot of teachings, learning deepened awareness, so that the mind begins to be more matured with the information, with the learning. When the maturation of the mind and learning arises, then that enables the person to come up with questions, doubts and hesitations. And that is the moment when a deepened relationship with the teachers begin, is when you can voice without any hesitation your questions, doubts. It is wrong if a person, and oftentimes I think in the West, in the East also, nowadays there is not much difference anymore, but where we think asking questions demonstrate our ignorance of that topic. We often hesitate to do that. We have the feeling that if I ask a certain question, then everybody knows the answer, and I'm the only one who doesn't know about this. There are embarrassments or any kind of other questions that come up, not getting into that hesitation, but being able to see, especially when it is a one-to-one question and answer between the teacher and yourself, learning to ask a question, and then if you don't know the answer, or if you are not satisfied with the answer, going ahead and re-asking that question until the person or the teacher is able to completely clarify the doubts that you have in your mind. That is then the method of establishing greater relationship with the teacher. And that's the second stage of progress. If we are going to talk about stages of progression, one way of looking at it would be two. And so here when we say Kyezoksum, the in-depth understanding of the teacher in Kyerim Dzogrim and the Dzogpa Chenpo is you're entering into the Vajrayana teachings when you study about Kyerim Dzogrim and Dzogpa Chenpo or Mahamudra teachings or Utpati Sampana Krama and non-dual Utpati Sampana Krama and Mahamudra Mahasandhi teachings. And so in that context, 10, 12, 15 years ago, Westerners would always talk a lot about, liking Buddhism because it's a non-theistic view. But today, it's a different situation where in many ways you've become very theistic, isn't it? Probably more theistic than many Tibetans. Oh, you can't beat that, but nevertheless, in some ways, if you see, you don't question why you do it. And we think not questioning is devotion, not questioning is trust. It could be. You could be very fortunate in that you have no hesitation and devote that generation of devotion, which is the absolute quality that can cut through all hesitations. But it is, again, individual responsibility to look inwards and see how much hesitation there still might be. If there is no hesitation, there's no problem. But if there are areas that are dark, areas that are unanswered, areas that still are confusing, then it requires that you do ask the questions, and therefore here, the person that you are working with needs to then have the quality of answering and dispelling those doubts and hesitations that are there in one's own self. Wangji Tsui Joba. Second quality that a secret Mantrayana or Mantrayana or Vajrayana master should have is said to be the accomplishment in the 4 Abhishekas. And so 4 Abhishekas are Vas Abhisheka, as is often then enumerated as is Vas Abhisheka, Secret Abhisheka, Prajna Abhisheka, and the Absolute Abhisheka. Abhisheka or empowerment, as is often referred to, is when you enter into the mandala of Mantrayana. And you receive instructions, Vajrayana instructions, through receiving the threefold transmissions. First is empowerment, second is oral transmission, lung, and as well as the explanations of the commentary of that particular text. And so when you are receiving or doing a certain practice, it is essential that each person has all the threefold transmissions. You must have the empowerment of that particular practice. You should have a commentary that has been in detail explained to you so you know what you are doing, and the lineage transference through the ability to receive the oral transmission. These three streams of receiving would then say that you have been entrusted with a particular sadhana, with a particular path of practices. Within the empowerment, then there is the opening of the mandala and introducing the individual meditator into the mandala of that particular deity. In general ways, many of you are familiar with Guru Yoga practices, as well as have received many initiations. So most of you are familiar with the fourfold abhishekas, or empowerments as they are called. Vaz abhisheka is the first abhisheka. Often several ways of looking at it. Simple, if I can simplify it, we could simply say we talk about four abhishekas. The first being Vaz, second being secret, third is wisdom, fourth is referred to as ultimate or absolute abhisheka. In receiving initiations, very often you receive the abhisheka where the teacher places a vase on your head. That is when the vase initiation is being taken. Then the second often is where the kapala, or the skull cup, where a little bit of wine is poured into your palms and then you drink that. That's called the kapala initiation or the secret initiation in many cases. Third, oftentimes, depending upon the teachings, but usually one would receive a crystal, or let's say the abhisheka of a tsali, photograph of the implements or so forth, anything that symbolizes the mind of the deities. And in some cases, there is the crystal that is given to oneself. A mirror or a melon can also be given to one's own self, and that is usually the wisdom initiation. In some cases, a mirror is smeared with red sindura and it is applied to your throat or applied to your heart. That's then receiving the prajna or the wisdom initiation. Fourth is often said to be the absolute or the ultimate initiation. Usually that is with some pointing out instruction that is given, and meditators or people who are receiving the initiation are asked to rest in meditation for some time. Now, general way of speaking with slight variations, these are the ways in receiving the empowerment. Meaning often is given in, again, outer and inner secret meanings. Outer meaning would be, first, vase initiation is where a meditator is going through the process of recognizing negative actions or obscurations of the body. And so my body creates negative obscurations, and different kinds of negative karma and defilements are created by my body. In taking the empowerment today, entering the Vajrayana practices today, generating the blessing and the entrustment of these teachings today, the teacher purifies through the blessings, and the recipient acknowledges and commits to purifying negativities of the body. And so therefore, through receiving the vase abhisheka or the initiation, may all the impurities of my body be dissolved. It is with that intention one receives the first initiation, the vase initiation. Second, the secret is about speech. And therefore, in giving the empowerment, the teacher gives the blessing of purification of speech. And the recipient goes through the understanding that may I enter the path of Vajrayana with the commitment to purify the negativities of my speech. Through receiving the Kabbalah initiation, may all impurities of my speech be purified. Likewise, with the prajna, all impurities of the mind be purified. And with the absolute, may I be able to rest in the complete purification of body, speech, and mind, which is the natural ground of primordial wisdom. And that is then said to be the intent behind receiving the four initiations. Accomplishment of the practices come about where receiving the vase initiation is said to accomplish the ability to really practice. Or in other words, we can say you get the permission to begin to practice Utpatti Krama. And so the recipient goes with, through receiving the vase initiation, I am grateful to have now the permission to practice Utpatti Krama. May I be able to realize Utpatti Krama practice Through that, may I be able to learn how everything is created. Phenomena is created, emotion is created, how I create everything, how all phenomena and the apparent phenomena is created by my own mind. May I be able to realize that essence. Through receiving the secret initiation or the Kapala initiation, then one is given the permission, one who's giving the initiation, with that one is empowered to practice nadis and pranas and tiglis. And so that again, as a recipient, one says, through receiving the second initiation, the secret initiation, may I be able to learn, practice, and understand nadis and pranas, channels and chakras of my body. May I be able to understand the essence of the elements that create the creation. And therefore, through training my body, through training my nadis, through training my pranas, breathing the essences, through that may I be able to accomplish the understanding of taming my mind. Then the third, or the wisdom initiation, is where then one gets the empowerment of practicing the completion or the sampanakrama phases. And as a recipient, one then commits to the receiving. Through this initiation, may I be able to purify my mind that allows itself to become the ground of awareness of the dissolution phase, of the Dzogchen phase, or the sampanakrama phase. And so may I be able to truly realize how every creation dissolves into my own mind. May I be able to realize the essence of my own mind as the basis of all creation. And so with the fourth ultimate initiation is that there is no distinction between creation and completion. There is no difference between arising and dissolving. Everything arises within the primordial nature of one's own mind. May I, through receiving the fourth initiation, develop absolute confidence of unwavering, indestructible primordial nature of mind. And that is the blessing that one receives, that is the pointing out that one receives, that is the commitment one takes, and if possible, remains within that. And then that is then said to be the four initiations that one receives. Receiving the Vaz initiation establishes the karma with understanding what Nirmanakaya is. Receiving the secret initiation, one is able to gain the understanding, the result, fruition of Sambhogakaya. Receiving the Prajna initiation, wisdom initiation, arises as the attainment of Dhammakaya. And the absolute initiation is said to be Mahasukha or Swabhavikakaya, as is often called. And so when we look at what Dharmakaya, if we see what Dharmakaya is, what Sambhogakaya is, what Nirmanakaya is within the Vajrayana Buddhism, Dharmakaya is a literal, philosophical, let's say a traditional term that's used. If we simplify that into just ordinary language, Dharmakaya is the core essence. Sambhogakaya is the brilliance. And Nirmanakaya is the manifest activity. A simple way of looking at it. Core essence of your mind, brilliance of its manifestations, and the manifest activity is happening at all times. The very primordial nature of your mind is there. It's pervasive at all times. That, however, has also, it's empty in nature, but it also has the brilliance of awareness, of compassion, of basic sanity, of goodness, and can manifest through your body, speech, and mind. Therefore, your body, speech, and mind is the Nirmanakaya. The genuine manifestation of the basic primordial wisdom is the Sambhogakaya. And the Dhammakaya is the very core essence of expansiveness or emptiness. And so three kayas are manifesting at all times. If you can remain within the non-duality of all the three manifestations, that is the fourth kaya, often referred to as Swabhavika kaya or Mahasukha kaya. And so here when we are talking about these three should be there, then the one who is from whom you are receiving these instructions of the Vajrayana or the secret mantrayana initiations, one should receive all the four abhishekas from that. Traditionally, when you receive an abhisheka from a particular teacher who presents to you all the four forms and goes through the transmission, let's say if I am going to receive a teaching from a certain teacher and it happens to be the cycle of Vajrasattva teachings or Manjushri teachings, then I would receive oral transmission, abhisheka, commentary on that particular teaching. The teacher would give me the four abhishekas and explain these different things and give me the practice. And so even in many of you have Guru Yoga practice, which towards the end, when we take the empowerment, it is all there, isn't it? You're familiar with the white light, the red light, and the blue light dissolving into one's own self from the seed syllable Om Ahung. This is yourself taking the 4 Abhishekas that we went through. And therefore, all these practices, when you receive from a certain teacher, then you begin to then establish a much more deepened commitment to that particular teacher. And so you begin to say, oh, this is the teacher from whom I am receiving Vajrayana instructions. And so Vajrayana instructions, and from whom you receive Vajrayana instructions, becomes a teacher that you're establishing a much more intimate, a much more profound relationship, because you are now not only talking about general topics, but you're also going beyond self into the understanding of the primordial wisdom. So it's the growth of your own understanding of Dharma and the courage and confidence with which you are progressing into traveling the path of egolessness. That which will require even greater awareness of less confusion or any kind of hesitation. And so the deepened respect, the deepened confidence and trust needs to be there. And so these are the different things that one examines. And in examining whether or not is how much teachings you receive regarding these 4 topics. And so expansively it needs to be there. It can be brief, as in presenting, as we did, very short, but then it's a lifetime process. What we spoke in 5 minutes will take a lifetime to understand what all these different things mean. If we take Dhammakaya, there are volumes composed on it, receive teachings from that. Sambhogakaya requires that much, Nirmanakaya requires that much. Kerim, Dzogrim, and Utpatikrama, Sampanakrama, non-dual Utpati, Sampana, Mahamudra, and Dzogchen requires similar kind of understanding. So whether or not this person from whom you are taking as a teacher is able to give you these teachings or not should also be examined. That's the point that is given here. Then again, the third quality that should be there is said to be entrusting oneself to a teacher who is able to truly examine the worthiness of a vessel, as the text says here, to whom the secret mantrayana is being given. Examining whether or not the teacher is examining the student. That is also very important. If this often then comes into the area of spiritual materialism. And so rampant as it is in today's world, often this is secret mantrayana teachings sometimes can be seen as very easily accessible to many people. And so if that easiness with which the accessibility is being made, then there is some reason where you can sit down and examine why that is being done so. If it is being done so from various ways, for example, in the traditional method of practices, each teacher has a different way of teaching, especially some of our greatest teachers who have lived, and those of you who have been fortunate in meeting with them, you will find that there are different. Some teachers are terribly strict with whom they teach, and they almost throw you out several times before you can actually get a word out of them in the form of teachings, and you have to really prove that you are at least brave enough to come back again and again and suitable enough to receive the teachings. Some are very kind, and you don't have to even ask anything, and they give out a pointing instruction immediately. And then, so if you ask teachers about how it is, then they have their own views. Some examine the vessel, the student very much. Some teachers really believe that the seed needs to be planted, whether or not that person can contain it or not. So they have their own views. So we can't say this is right and that is wrong, or whichever it is. But at the same time, what we can do is, in today's times as students of Dharma, really examine and see how much spiritual materialism is there. And there are spiritual materialism that, whether it is for profit making, whether it is for territoriality, whether it is for money, whether it is for popularity, whether it is for increased membership of a particular place, whether it is, or whatever it is that you and I are all familiar with. We live with this in our entire lifetime, so I won't go into details. But examining and questioning that becomes our responsibility. Fourth is then said to be the examining whether or not the teacher has the accomplishment of being able to really understand the meaning of Tantra, and especially if you are receiving Tantra teachings, then being able to really examine, taking time to examine whether or not the teacher from whom you are receiving the Tantra instructions is adept in Tantra, is able to truly practice that. How much of that explanation of the Tantra seems to be embedded in selfishness? That is, again, one way of looking at it carefully. 2 points to this. One is said to be whether or not the teacher examines the mind of the person to whom the Tantra is being given. And so not working with one's own arrogance or ego, imagining that we can hold the Tantra teachings, but really seeing how much that teacher is taking examination of what your mind is, whether it's mature or not, whether the teacher knows your mind or the minds of the person who is receiving the Tantra instructions, whether that is there or not should be examined. On the other hand, again, certain times, especially in the degenerate times, Tantra is given or we receive Tantra instructions to pacify our own curiosity and for various means that we tend to see as whether a speedier way or whether things that allow us to do certain things that we like. For example, drinking alcohol in Tantra is a great attraction for many, many people. And so we often go through these massive arguments with many practitioners. There is a point in Vajrayana practice when we talk about transcending poison into medicine. There's a point where we talk about non-duality, and just as purity and impurity are the same in single taste, and therefore there shouldn't be any kind of discrimination. Indeed, but you can't fool yourself, isn't it? You have to be able to look into your own self and see whether you are the kind of person who is non-dual, remaining in non-duality, or whether you are misusing Tantra to simply give yourself an excuse to do the things that you were not allowed to do in Hinayana and Mahayana part of the practices. That is entirely up to one's own individual understanding. No one knows you better than yourself. And therefore, as a student, knowing your own capacity and through that seeing, examining whether the teacher seems to know you or not, that seems to be one of the examinations that needs to be carried on. Then the next quality is said to be examining how much the teacher is adept in the activities of the four karmas, in the activity of pacifying, increasing, magnetizing, and subjugating, what are known as the four karmas. Whether or not the teacher is able to completely accomplish these activities and know the meaning of these activities is essential. Then again, examining, the next is said to be examining carefully whether or not the teacher has great experiences or extensive experiences in the oral lineages and realizing the wisdom of the instructions. And so how much of the treasure teachings, how much of the oral transmissions the teacher has received. And that then simply would be examining the history of the teacher's learning and understanding. And so in many ways, when you are going to study from a certain teacher, there becomes the importance of knowing the lineage that you are going to practice. And so the continuity of the lineage and how it was received, how much of these transmissions has the teacher himself received, that becomes essential for one's own self. And therefore, practicing or investigating this is essential. In short, as the text says, three main things that should be, a few of these qualities that should be really examined, and that is kepi sherab, zewe samba, jorwa sopa sum. Three things. First is wisdom, second is genuine compassion, and third is tolerance. How much of these qualities are there? Even if one doesn't go into all these different examinations that we did, ultimately, if one were to sum it up and see the three main characteristics that are necessary that a teacher does have, then these are the three main qualities that should be there. Expansive, vast, flexible wisdom that is able to really recognize the essence of the teachings. Compassion, genuine, selfless compassion that works for the benefit, selflessly for the benefit of all other sentient beings. And third is indestructible, genuine tolerance towards all the situations, circumstances as it arises. Examining whether these three qualities are there is essential. If one hears about or sees, in examining, sees all these different qualities that are there in a certain teacher, then without any hesitation, one can completely entrust one's learning and taking the path of the teachings into in accordance to the instructions that is given to one's own self, realizing, as the text says, that it is only a very fortunate person who is able to meet with teachers such as this, and therefore no longer is one needed, or one needs to have confirmation from another person that you can trust this person, that you can trust this teacher, and therefore being able to work with the teachings in this way is essential. And so in terms of, again, the text, although we can skip this over, but there is one section which the text talks about 3 ways of examining the teachings and teachers. And so 3 ways of examining the teachers is simply given as Jani Hien Latine Dao. In the first, one could probably go about, and so it's probably a good answer to many questions that we come about, is how can we examine a teacher? And so how to examine a teacher is given in 3 ways. It's a little bit funny, so I'll mention it. So first is said to be from the distance ask. And so you could ask around and know more about this teacher. Second is said to be zhongneta, which is go close and then examine. Live with this teacher, be with this teacher for some time in close proximity, and examine this teacher and see whether or not these qualities are present. If there are doubts and hesitation, asking, questioning, and seeing what the answers are. And if then one is satisfied, then going ahead. If not, then again taking a distance. And then the third way is, I think, what is very interesting and might be very useful for you, and that is said to be ask the oracles whether or not that teacher is good for you or not. And so that would be interesting for you to go through. Then in the second section is qualities that need to be developed or need to be examined in the student or in the practitioner himself or herself. And then these are the qualities that a teacher needs to examine in a student, and if possible not to teach, or at least in terms of the secret profound instructions, be able to really examine whether or not the presence of these qualities are there is essential. But the way we would look at it also is each person who is on the path of the teachings examines within one's own self whether or not those qualities are present in one's own self. First is then said to be the student or anyone on the path of the practices needs to be one who has no pride or ego, genuine confidence, and genuine longing, respect, or longing faith and respect to the ones from whom you are receiving teachings. Then the next quality is said to be the presence of natural discriminating wisdom. Then is said to be the quality of genuinely generating endeavor or right effort, so that the person has the ability to gather everything into the path of the practices. And so the first one, no pride, simply means the sense of simplicity and humility must be there in the mind of the person. When it is a path of practice that requires change and transformation to occur, that change and transformation will not happen until suppleness of the attitude is there. No pride doesn't have to be a sense of not having any freedom of one's own self, not having any kind of thought about one's own self. No pride here much more means about willingness to go through the changes and the transformation. And so where there is no willingness for that suppleness of the mind to be there, for any change or transformation that needs to come about, it becomes very, very difficult. And so it's essential in the beginning to examine within one's own self and see how much arrogance, how much stubbornness, how much rigidity of one's own ego is there within oneself or not. And so if you are going with that, if I am going to remain with that, what damage or to whom does the damage do? And so the damage is up to one's own self. And so container that is already full, no matter how much you pour into it, only overflows. There's not much you can do about it. Similarly, no matter how good a sculptor is, if the sculpture is already formed and dried, you would have no other choice but to break it. Then molding it again further is going to be very difficult. Therefore, examining carefully how much of that ego-grasping, sort of indignant stubbornness is there or not in one's own self needs to be essential to examine. Confidence and respect, devotion and respect as is often referred to. Devotion and respect is not something that can be generated or given to one's own self. Neither should devotion be generated based upon what you have heard and someone telling you to do so. That becomes superficial devotion. Superficial devotion is almost flattery in some ways. It's a flattery where you agree to do a lot of things that you don't know what you are talking about, that will eventually encounter some kind of difficulty that's going to create hesitation and doubt. Therefore, genuine confidence can only arise from proper examination. Examining any teaching, whether it is the simplest of the simple words that you may hear. You may go through an entire teaching and not have retained many of the things that you have heard. But if you hear only a single word, whether it is suffering, whether it is love, whether it is compassion or wisdom, any one word that you can retain but thoroughly examine, so that hearing it, you retain it, you think about it, you examine it until you come to a point of saying, experientially, I realize, I understand what this word is talking about, and then you decide whether it makes sense or not. If it does, then the confidence of having experienced the value or the truth in what you have been examining, that is the kind of devotion we are talking about. And so whether it is in the teachings, whether it is in the practice, whether it is in any of the essences that you are meditating upon, taking time to really think about it, question it, examine it, until you come up with the understanding that is beyond any hesitation and doubt. When that is so, then laziness, distraction, habitual patterns, outer distractions, inner distractions can no longer impede the confidence which you hold the essence of that meaning of the mind. It's almost the same analogy as we say, if somebody holds a knife to one's own neck and say that if your name is, let's say, Tom, and then they hold the knife to your throat and say, you from this moment say that you are not Tom, otherwise I'm going to kill you, then to save your life you can always say, I'm not Tom, isn't it? But deep and down, there cannot be the destruction of the conviction, oh, whatever I say doesn't matter because Tom, I am Tom. That conviction that is there. Likewise, in being able to understand emptiness, in being able to understand selflessness, egolessness, we are talking about generating such an unshakable confidence of what it is. At the moment, because of the lacking in the analysis, although we have devotion, much of our devotion is respect. Much of our devotion is an uncontested sense of agreement that this might be a good thing. So it might be empty. It might be selfless. It is necessary to be egoless. But because the conviction, the absolute confidence may be lacking in, therefore we forget very easily. Comes our own different kinds of neurosis and out goes emptiness, isn't it? So we meditate for a full day on the empty nature of emotions, and then you get a telephone call about you've just lost your job. You can't visualize emptiness or maintain emptiness. Much of emptiness goes completely away. And so you are resting in impermanence and sense of emptiness, and you're resting in the pure nature of Dhammakaya and absolute nature of this and that, and Tathagata Garbha and nature of suchness, one taste. And then you get a telephone call and your husband has left you. Impermanence you don't remember impermanence very much at that moment. And so you're drawn into that situation. So that's again talking about less confidence. Here we are talking about, therefore, examining carefully how much an in-depth of confidence is there in one's own mind. If confidence is lacking, if devotion, I'm using the word confidence, the text says tepa, or devotion. If devotion is lacking in the path of the practice, in the teachings, teacher, it says lacking in devotion to the teacher. But here, teacher and teachings are not two different things. Teacher is a conduit. Usually it is a medium from where the teachings come about. And so what can you do by grasping to a teacher? What you are needed is the essence of the teachings that are being given to you. Therefore, devotion in the essence of the teachings, how much is there within one's own self needs to be examined by a meditator. A teacher also needs to examine how much devotion there is to the path of the practices, and only upon examination, accordingly, number of teachings can be, sequential progression of the teachings can be given to the meditator. Then that person or the meditator should have what is known as the natural discriminating wisdom. And so two kinds of wisdom have been spoken within this text. Natural wisdom and the wisdom that arises from the three prajnas, as has been given here. Natural wisdom is then said to be the ability to truly work with one's own intrinsic awareness. And so that the two qualities that are said to be that which manifests as the natural wisdom or natural discriminating wisdom is said to be Yangba and Jachewa, relaxation or natural relaxation of the mind and vastness of the mind that is supple and vast. Two qualities that are extremely necessary that be present in anyone on the path of meditation. Relaxation is, again, not the kind of resting relaxation. Relaxation is about an openness, a gentleness, and a vastness, pervasiveness, a quality that is absolutely essential if that meditator is going to truly work towards generating qualities of compassion or wisdom. Non-relaxed mind would be agitated mind, easily irritated, easily enthused, easily excited, easily tense, and so the flickering mind that we often talk about, which is not able to have a much more open view, much more vast and a supple view, but often hears something and changes, sees something and changes, talks about something and changes. When every moment there is a flickeredness of the mind, when there is a changing, transformation of the mind, such a mind is often said to be a weakened mind. That mind can never really rest, can never really be open, can never really be expansive. And so there's always a movement, a change that's occurring at all times. Such a mind still is said to be a mind that needs to be ready, needs to go through the processes of working with its own relaxation. Also within the context of Vajrayana teachings, a mind that is not pervasive, mind that is not open and more calm is a mind that often has a lot of difficulty in understanding the natural essence, and there's a constant worry. Relaxation doesn't come about because of constant worry about the self. If the self-grasping is there, selfishness is there, self-absorption is there, and therefore continually there will come about the difficulties. Ting Sapa or in-depth, vast mind that is very deep is again said to be one that is not easily agitated, easily tensed. And so that Ting Sapa is often always said to be where no matter how much teachings such a meditator receives, often it does encounter selfishness. And so that is a common, let's say, difficulty that many meditators have, is we spend an entire lifetime receiving teachings on kindness and compassion. Yet the depth of that compassion doesn't occur in our mind. There is still jealousy, there is still competitiveness, there is still the inability to like one another. Degenerate age is what we blame always, but if we look carefully, no one creates degenerate age, we bring about degenerate age. Look at us among centers, for example, how much competition is there? We hide our members behind our backs and we claim there is nothing happening here, or whatever it is, in terms of our conversation with one another. If I say 2, the other says 3. If this one says 3, I say 4. So there's this sort of competition that's always there. Among two Buddhists or among two meditators, that kind of competition is always there. And that's, again, much more closer to home. But even in our daily activities, it's not that we don't know about compassion. We know about compassion, and yet at some level we close the lid of our mind and we don't let the penetration of insight, of wisdom, to truly be there in ourselves. We talk about emptiness, but we do nothing when it comes to letting go of the things that we like the most. We talk about tolerance and patience, but we don't allow others to invade in our own territory and our own private space. It irritates us tremendously. We talk about compassion and love, but deep down in our minds, we meditate for our own peace of mind, for our own self, for our own liberation. And so, depth of the meaning of the teachings do not grow in such a mind. Therefore, when the container within which the teachings are being poured does not have the relaxation, the vastness, and the depth that is required, how can that mind then understand emptiness and genuine selflessness and completely give up ego grasping? That's like filling the entire ocean in a small cup. And so cup will be drowned completely in that sense. So that the cup cannot hold the ocean at all. Similarly, the mind of the meditator needs to be examined and seen whether or not these qualities are present or not present. And if it is not present, then again, thinking according to that becomes essential. And then again, again, as a meditator, as a practitioner, examining in one's own self and seeing whether or not that amount of relaxation and vastness of my attitude is coming or not, that is extremely important to practice. Often, when meditators are given certain practices, teachers often will give you certain practices to practice, and we have meditators come up and say, oh, I have done 100,000 of mantras that you've told me to do. I've made the prostrations, I've done the retreat, or I've done the practices as you wanted me to do. And usually, a method of investigation is not about how many things that you have actually done outwardly. Those are good. You may do 300,000 of this or 1,000,000 of that and 100,000 of this and so forth. But that does not say much about how much practice this person has done, as much as through the practices, how much suppleness of attitude has been developed by that meditator. How much of an easygoing nature, a flexible nature is there. Small things, such as things working according to your expectations and things not working according to your expectations, and how you deal with that, often determines what kind of a meditator you've become more, and tells more about you than about how many different mantras you've done, how many sittings and retreats you've done. And so sitting in caves, sitting in retreat, doing the practices that you have committed yourself to, those are methods again. Those are forms that keep the discipline of the practices that have been happening. What is said about what kind of a progress in meditation you've done about is how you look at each situation that you come about, how you do the actions, how much suppleness of actions of the body have you been able to develop, how much easiness with the speech is there that it says the things that is required and knows when to keep quiet. Simple things, but that which says a lot more about egolessness than having recited mantras millionfold times. Mind that has become much more easy, much more supple, much more flexible. If it gets done, it gets done. If it doesn't get done, learning to touch and go at all times. So supple and so easy that it can blend and work with the moment as it arises. If that kind of suppleness and vastness of the attitude is arising, then meditation and the meditator is progressing on the path. Otherwise, no teacher will be very impressed when you say your visualization is clear, or you saw this deity, or you did not see that deity. That's all very good, but it's still in the realm of delusion. And so therefore, then endeavor and effort on the path of the practices is said to be the other quality. How easily or not a meditator immediately succumbs to the difficulties that one encounters on the path of the practices. We begin our journey on the path of the practices knowing that we are working in an imperfect world. However, we often forget that, and we think that the world needs to become perfect so that we can practice perfectly. And so not being able to understand that, often we encounter life within samsara arises as the fruition, manifestation of all the different karmas that we accumulate. And so life is full of circumstances that are favorable and good, as well as circumstances that are very difficult. Sicknesses will come, death will come, loved ones will part away, what is gathered will disperse, what is formed will break down, what we get will be torn away, will be lost. We all knew that. But at the same time, when difficulties come, often meditator is taken by surprise and we imagine, how did that ever happen to me? Everything was supposed to be conducive to my practices. While I am practicing, these were not supposed to happen to me. And when difficulties come, the first thing that goes is practice. And so that's often the case that happens in our life. And that also talks a lot about how very much you value the path of practices. When difficult circumstances arises in our life, we don't give up watching movies, we don't give up socializing, we don't give up the gossiping, we don't give up the different kinds of lamenting that we do. We don't give up anything. What we do give up is practice. We give up sitting, we give up meditating, we give up the mantras, almost believing that the cause of that difficulty was the practice and not the karma that we accumulated in our life. Such a person demonstrates also, as a meditator, we need to examine within our own selves and see, therefore, what is the value of practice in one's own life? Have we ever actually, no matter whether one is a Vajrayana or Mahayana student, whichever level one may be, questioning oneself to be able to see whether we in the beginning at all recognized the profoundness and the value of the paths that we were walking on. If we are having difficulty in taking practice into daily life, perhaps the reason is that in the list of priority, practice is actually very lowly placed. of all the things to do, perhaps meditation and practice and the qualities that we are trying to develop has been a recreation activity rather than seeing it as the most important thing that needs to be developed. Therefore, if the foundation of the value of the practices itself is weak, then of course integrating it and being mindful of those qualities in daily life, full of distractions, which is full of distraction, is going to be very, very difficult. And so it is essential to examine whether or not that is a tendency is there within one's own self. Teachers need to examine and see how much diligence and effort a meditator is exerting in the circumstances that are difficult. And if there is still the diligence, then that's a good sign. If there is lacking in that diligence, then that meditator needs to go back to the basic practices and again restructure, rethink, and re-strengthen one's motivation and understanding of the teachings. But foremost of all, within our own selves, we need to see how much exertion of effort am I able to develop. When we examine these qualities, the absence and the presence of these qualities, often what will come about is the key understanding of why it becomes so very difficult to live the practices that we treasure so much. And so working with these qualities, as we develop these qualities, that then also permeates much more in our characteristics and attitudes. And so mindfulness of the teachings and the meditation and who we are as meditators is able to better permeate in our activities, daily actions of body, speech, and mind. So some of the many different qualities that are enumerated in the text, these are some of the qualities. And then in the afternoon, we can go through the simple part of meditation, which is given within the context of the Mahamudra teachings, but a simple practice that can be developed as the basis of really working with generating awareness. Yesterday, we began with the three main qualities of reflecting on suffering, impermanence, and transformation or change. And emptiness. And so given that context, a basis of meditation that can be taken as meditation and post-meditation that one can remain within, that could be also said to be a foundation of mingling practice and daily life at all times. And so basically, as all teachings will say, there is no meditation and post-meditation. We can define it in that way. But those are mainly for people who are on the beginning stages of practices. If you're completely new into Dharma and practice, then we can say there's a session of practice and then you break and then you go into post-meditation. But most of you, as you raised up your hands as Vajrayana meditators yesterday, then at such a point, there is no meditation, post-meditation. Anywhere your mind is a place where meditation can happen. If there was a point where you said, I have mind in meditation, but when I'm not meditating, I don't have a mind, then we could say there's a post-meditation and a meditation. So somewhat to that degree we can talk about in the afternoon then.